Welcome back to the Stein Fireside Chats. Today we're blessed to have Dr. Michael Breakspear from Australia coming to talk to us. Dr. Breakspear, what we have here is a Stein for you. Stein Fireside Chats. It stands for Society for Technology, Engineering and Innovation in Neurosurgery, although now at the end sort of is like neuroscience and neurology as well. So this was from Boston earlier this year when we had the neurosurgery meeting there. And the quote below it is a Bruce Springsteen lyric translated badly into Dutch. And it's sort of a humanist thing from one of his songs.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So, Dr. Breakspear, hopefully we can get you to talk a little bit about the path that brought you to, sort of being a world-leading neuroscientist, and ask you some questions on the way. So, let's say starting with what got you into science as a kid.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, obviously, most people's interest in science gets triggered during school and high school. So I went to a very alternative schooling in a city of Australia called Canberra, where we were unleashed on all the science teachers and the facilities of science in year 10, so we were about 14, 15, and we had 6 months to do a single experiment and no other imposts or structure. So I ended up doing an experiment on how algae responded to different types of light, but you could make plastics, you could make beer and make explosives.
You make beer in high school?
Yeah, we made explosives, beer. And also, this was way back in 1984 or so, we had a Mac lab and we all learned to program in BASIC, and we were doing pretty advanced algebra and maths at the time. And we even had Telnet, which was the forerunner of the internet. I remember our math teacher showing us this big clunky computer, and you dialed up and you heard the typical fax sound, and you put it on a speaker, and then you could put a few command lines in and it would go, you could almost see the computer going from node to node, and it would execute a few lines of your code and then go on to the next person. And it was way slower than the Macs. Back then there were these big Macs that we basically wrote games on in BASIC. And I remember saying to Mr. Barker that I didn't think there was any future in this Telnet. So that was one of the many times I was extraordinarily wrong. But yeah, that really triggered my interest in understanding how things work, understanding how to use mathematics. And we moved to Sydney. I was brought up by my mum, and I had my three sisters. And my mum was pretty old-fashioned. And going to Sydney to a more sort of a fancier but more traditional school, I decided at some point I'd go into medicine and become a doctor. And I announced this to my mum, expecting that she'd be thrilled, because we weren't very well off. And she was shocked, and she said to me, "Michael, you were going to be a mathematician. What do you want to work in medicine for? You should do mathematics." So I went off, I enrolled in mathematics, but in medicine actually, and I was immediately sort of grappled with the loss of the opportunities to learn about physics, maths. I got this library a book on relativity from the library, and I thought if I read it really intensely, given my gifted IQ, I would understand relativity.
Was it Mr. Tompkins in paperback? Did you ever see it?
No, it was a proper physics textbook. Okay. And I sort of failed miserably to understand relativity despite of staring at the equations for hours. So I actually went and enrolled in mathematics, and I did, in the end, 4 years of applied mathematics.
And this is before medicine?
I sort of weaved them in. So I'd sort of rock up to histology class with all my kindred spirits in medicine, looking at slides of the liver with hepatitis. And then I would rush off to a maths lecture and learn about, Green's theorem and all of this stuff. And it just kept me I still went out, I still had a good time, I still went to parties, but just kept me intellectually intrigued, I guess.
Yeah.
I remember a lot of the medical colleagues in medical school were thinking, "Why are you doing maths? It's so geeky, And I just looked at these people, and I didn't even try and explain to them that the maths classes were full of people playing in punk rock bands and, with dreadlocks and really interesting lives.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I basically wove these two worlds right through my career, sort of jumping from one to the other.
So it was always both?
It was always both, yeah. And every time I got more into one, then I'd have a sort of a separation anxiety from the other. And so I became a trainee in psychiatry and went and enrolled in PhD and ended up getting into the School of Theoretical Physics. And at some stage, I started to think, will I finish my psychiatry training? And actually, Carl Friston, who you know is a famous neuroscientist, was becoming a very good friend of mine. And he told me,
how did you get to know Carl? He was in London.
I'll get to that. He told me, Michael, you always feel guilty if you don't finish your psychiatry training. So I finished my psychiatry training, and then I was kind of set in this unusual epoch of being physics and maths trained and a clinician.
So how did you pick psychiatry initially then, among the other
It's
fields?
another random thing.
Okay.
So I've never sort of done anything that I thought was a good idea at the time or beforehand. So I did psychiatry as a junior intern, and I really loved it, you know. And then I went and did medicine and surgery. You do this in Australia. You do rotations in a medicine emergency department, surgery, and I enjoyed those, but the funnest term I had was definitely psychiatry, and it was also a really deeply intellectual term. I tried to think about what was causing people to behave or think in unusual ways, and I had good mentors there too, really good psychiatrists, really committed to the welfare of their patients, and obviously often patients who were, you know, living homelessly and had suffered from their mental illness, and so I was really struck by that.
So it's like you picked it based on the kind of the clinical love, and then later on you were able to merge the two
definitely
together.
By the love of the clinical experience. And then I was going to do intensive care or something. And I thought, no, I should go and try this psychiatry gig one more time. And then I tried out as a psychiatry registrar and I actually didn't get onto the program because I told them I didn't know what I wanted to do.
Okay.
So I think the selection committee had 4 candidates with 3 places, and they chose me as the unsuccessful candidate. So then I went to another interview, and of course I told these guys that I definitely wanted to be a psychiatrist. It was a hankering I'd had for many years, so they put me into the other program.
And was that after you finished your PhD?
No, that was before I even started my PhD.
Okay.
So I finished all my undergraduate training, got into the psychiatry program, and then I enrolled in a PhD. And then, so to answer your question about Carl, after 2 years of this strange integration, I think the other thing is psychiatry let you be part-time and imagine that you might have another life. Whereas physicians training, you had to learn all these thick textbooks and that's all you would do. So my then girlfriend, now wife, declared she wanted to live in London and Europe for a year. So I emailed a mathematician over there and I ended up at the University of Surrey for a year doing maths, which was great. And then I emailed a couple of psychiatrists, Ed Bullmore and Carl Friston, and went up to London. Barely knew anything about Carl, you know, and met Carl because I was training in mathematics.
So for those of us, well, I mean, we know who Friston is obviously, but for those in our audience who may not know about Carl Friston, his contribution to systems neuroscience and our understanding of brain structure, could you tell us a little about him?
Well, Carl wrote in the 90s many formative papers about dynamical systems theory and their role in cognition and brain sciences. And in parallel, basically over a couple of summers, wrote the entire pipeline for analysing fMRI data, including all the pre-processing and the general linear model and the statistics package. So yeah, he's an extremely deep and gifted and technically adept thinker. And he's a psychiatrist who was very formative in the functional imaging laboratory in London in Queen Square. And there was a whole intellectual field around Carl and the people he was mentoring and his colleagues at Queen Square. But at that time, I was studying applied mathematics and I wasn't deeply immersed in fMRI. I'd done some EEG. So yeah, I pretty soon got to know that Carl was a very influential, famous neuroscientist, but you know, he's the sort of guy you meet him and you're just meeting, you know, he's 10 years older than me, you know, a person, and he was very interested in the dynamical systems theory that I was formerly being trained in and how it overlapped with his own interests. Yeah, so that was a really great meeting, and I wrote a couple of small papers with Carl, but he was definitely an influential role in my intellectual journey. And at the end of it all, I got my fellowship in psychiatry, and I did a PhD in theoretical physics, or in the School of Theoretical Physics, but it was in theoretical neuroscience, and became a psychiatrist in the same school that rejected me
Really?
as a junior trainee.
At Sydney University?
No, this was at University of New South Wales. I sort of jumped ship and got an academic role there. I mean, there's two big universities in Sydney, University of Sydney, University of New South Wales, but they're both very strong universities.
Yeah. And I know your Robinson is at Sydney University.
Yeah, so my PhD was largely with Evian Gordon, but largely with Peter Robinson in the School of Physics. And Peter's an old school theoretical physicist who went into neuroscience, but very trained in mathematics, applied physics. Actually, probably wouldn't think of himself as a mathematician, but very old school. So he taught me a lot about how to write a paper, all of these formal scientific processes that I think it's great if you get a mentor along the way who tells you in no uncertain terms with red ink all the mistakes you've made in the draft manuscript, and still does to this day if I work on a paper with him.
Physical copy?
Oh, actually these days he prints it out, he scribbles all over it. If he's not happy with something, the writing goes into capital letters.
Okay.
Then you know that, he's not happy. Then he photographs it. This is Peter becoming high tech. He then sent it to me as a WhatsApp, 27 WhatsApp messages, each with a piece of paper. And of course you kind of get mad at first because you're thinking of yourself as some important neuroscientist, and your former postdoc supervisor is going downtown because you use past tense and not present tense, and didn't call out the figures properly and used the wrong subscripts. But then you realize, well, I mean, actually it's all technically correct. So
Yeah.
swallow your pride and make all the corrections, and it's a better paper.
For sure, yeah. I guess I met you at a conference where Terry Sinofsky had a workshop for the Sloan workshop in San Diego.
Yeah.
And I was lucky because this guy, Bob Knight, when he had his talk, called me out of the audience to come present my stuff, which I thought was kind of funny during his talk. And then afterwards, I was talking to you because I was a grad student in physics at the time. And you said, yeah, you had your PhD in physics. Then you told me you surfed.
Yeah.
And so we went surfing together in San Diego, and now that I live in the middle of Minnesota, not surfing so much. But that's not the case for you, right? This has been something your whole life. I mean, in fact, you're somewhat famous, I think, in Australia and elsewhere for being this sort of this amazing guy who surfs and also is a theoretical physicist and also a doctor.
Yeah, there's a sort of spin and a hype. I mean, I live in a beautiful city called Newcastle, and it's blessed with beautiful waves. It's called a Wabical country. That's the name of the indigenous people who've lived there for many years. It's an extraordinary surf town. It's got a good university. It's close to Sydney. It's a better lifestyle of Sydney. But one of the reasons that we moved from Brisbane to Newcastle was, our love, my wife and I, and my children's love of the ocean and my love of the surf. Yeah. Now in Newcastle, that's like the Mayo Clinic of surfing.
Okay, yeah.
There's 2 or 3 surfers in the world's top 40 at the moment who call Newcastle and Merewether Reef in particular their hometown.
Is that your local spot?
I don't surf at Merewether Reef, but the city is full of beautiful surf reefs, and you can walk just out of the main strip and you can get uncrowded waves. I mean, I'm going out there as a sort of very much mid-tier surfer who's not afraid to take on the bigger waves. I wouldn't call myself an amazing surfer. An adept surfer. I can get out there, I can get waves, I can keep out of trouble with the really good surfers. Some of them are even, chat to me because it's all fairly friendly now.
Yeah, that's good.
How often do you get out there?
I go pretty much every time there's good surf, unless I can't go out there because I'm traveling or something. So yeah, most hardcore surfers would drop everything when the surf's good. And when the surf's good, it's really good. And there's dolphins. We saw a seal in the surf the other day. There's currently whales. I haven't seen the whales yet this season. And even sharks. Sometimes if you're in the wrong spot at the right time, you'll see a shark. Not that often, but I did see a pretty big shark.
Do you mean like reef sharks or like
Yeah, mostly you see reef sharks or grey nurse sharks. But every now and then you see what you could call a very large fish
Yeah, sure, like a bull shark or a tiger shark.
or a white shark. But they're not looking for you. They're just swimming around chasing another fish.
Paddle out.
Yeah, I tell you, you don't stay in the water very long.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think this is like whatever you do as science, and Kai and I have been chatting about this, to stay sort of fresh and in the field, you need to have a balance. You need to sort of prioritize your family and friends. You definitely need, I think, to stay healthy, physical activity. And that's my physical activity. And it's good for the ego to get out and realize that you're just they don't care what you're giving your talks or where you're going. If you get in the way of a good wave, if you paddle for it, you better take off on it.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Really awesome that you're surfing a lot. Is it mostly, and we'll get back to the science in a moment, but is it mostly rock reef or live reef?
It's mainly beach breaks that I
Okay.
surf. There are some rock reefs.
Yeah.
Merriweather is
Yeah.
one. But there's a lot of beach breaks, and you get out of the crowd a little bit if you go to a beach break.
It's sort of a cheesy transition, but the idea that when you catch waves, there's this oscillatory process and it comes to a cascade because of the shape of the ground. And actually, in your case, the mathematics that you're looking at in the brain are somewhat related, right? You
Yeah.
take equations for understanding dynamical systems
Yeah.
and apply them to understand distributed networks in the brain. And of course, this is what you've been working on recently. Can you tell me about, I guess, in the most basic sense, the mathematical equations that you're applying to the brain? What are they telling you at the most fundamental level, or I guess not, at the most basic level? What do they tell you about how information is processed in the brain?
So I was always interested in dynamical systems theory and nonlinear dynamics. And in the beginning of my career, of course, chaos had been very popular, and it had a bit of an impact on neuroscience, like were brain waves or were brain states chaotic. It turns out to be a lot more complicated than that, and often the brain is quite stable at the larger scales, and there's these occasional incursions of highly nonlinear dynamics, even as we're sitting here talking, and they're probably important for the state transitions. For example, you just segued into a new topic,
Sure, yeah.
and probably at some point of contemplating what we were talking about and thinking of the next topic, there was some turbulence in your mind that
Sure.
allowed that sort of state transition. So I was interested in applying the theory of dynamical systems to get a deeper understanding of what the brain was doing. And initially there was a lot of signal processing using nonlinear techniques. Then, well, of course, I went into the School of Physics. I think I was pretty lucky. I mean, I was always interested in a deeper understanding of things, hence my earlier quests to understand relativity. By the way, I did do applied mathematics, and I ended up doing a course in relativity. And
AGR.
yeah, I ended up, I think we did the special theory of relativity, which was more part of dynamics.
Yeah.
Then I didn't do a lot of coursework in physics. We did the Navier-Stokes equation for fluid dynamics, the Maxwell equation for electrodynamics,
Sure.
standard theory for quantum mechanics, Schrodinger's equation for the particle. So every field had these unifying equations. And there were certain simplifications, or there were applications of even deeper principles that were formulated. So the Navier-Stokes equations for fluid is basically Newton's equations of motion, F equals ma, put into the context of fluid. So working with Peter Robinson and others, then, the field had, back in the 70s and 80s, pretty ambitious attempts to do unifying theories of brain function using wave equations. And the work of Walter Freeman,
Of course.
Paul Nunez, who are the other very formative prescient thinkers.
Well, I think Sanofsky has to be in any of those conversations.
Perry Sanofsky.
There was the whole school at UCL. I mean, they were more, I think they were a little bit later. Well, were they not
Oh, it was
UCL?
Carl Friston.
No, I was thinking more of the, what's the institute called? The Theoretical Neuroscience Institute.
Oh yeah, the Gatsby Institute.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, but that
was later on.
They were more interested in the cognitive,
Yeah.
computational cognitive neuroscience.
And there was Larry Abbott. I don't know if you remember him.
I remember Larry.
Yeah.
So there's a number of people, but if you go back, Herman Harkin,
Yeah.
If you go back to the people trying to write a field equation for
Sure.
large-scale brain activity, you'll find it in papers like journals like Biological Cybernetics,
Sure.
other good journals of the time. But in the 90s and thereafter, physicists like Peter Robertson, Vic Yersa started picking it up and running with it. So I got into that field. So these are field equations for large-scale brain dynamics.
And what you're doing right now is sort of, I mean, when you came to visit initially, you've given talks for our labs before, and I've read your papers. But in my mind, it's sort of thinking about it as applying Schrodinger's equation to distributed brain activity. And you said no, it's more like a damped oscillator.
Yeah.
Because I guess why don't you tell us how does it differ from, how do the solutions that you find for brain activity, and maybe we can have you show us a couple slides, but how do they differ from, let's say, applications of Schrodinger's equation?
Well, the principal thing, and as you know, is the brain is full of oscillations distributed in time and space.
Yeah.
Right? And to get an oscillation, a basic principle is you need a second order term in time.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a first order term in time, you'll have some sort of activity and it's like a diffusion process. So there won't be an oscillation, there'll just be a relaxation towards the baseline state. So if you want an oscillation, you need to have a second order term.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to have something with momentum. This goes back to Newton's equations, right? F equals ma is a second order differential equation, and that's how you get a harmonic oscillator.
Sure.
Now these aren't force-fed into field equations. They can actually be derived from Hodgkin-Huxley or simplified conductance models of the neuron. People like Steve Coombs and others have done this. Mm-hmm. And what you end up with is a PDE with a second order time term.
Yeah.
And that's because neurons oscillate. So when you make a macroscopic simplification, you get that second order term. The Schrödinger equation is just first order in time.
Yes.
So it doesn't oscillate, it can propagate, and it can the state can disperse.
Yeah.
But without a second order time term, you won't get a sustained oscillation or a damped or a blowaway oscillation. And then you've got the second order term in space, so-called the Laplacian, but that's in most PDEs.
Yeah.
And that just allows things to move in space while they propagate or oscillate in time. So those equations can be derived, and people have done formal descriptions. Steve Coombs has a beautiful paper. Depending on how neurons are connected, you can derive different types of PDEs. But all of this started blowing back up again when I was doing my postdoc. And so I worked with Peter, and we published a couple of papers looking at the application of neural field theory to epilepsy.
Yeah.
Then the field may have gone a bit quiet, at least in my mind, or I started working on other topics. But then, in the last few years, it's really reached another level of impact and influence. So the other aspect of a neural field equation or a damped wave equation are the spatial patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And as I've got in some of my talks, these spatial patterns depend on the geometry of the object that they occur on.
So I'm used to thinking about that as you basically have some process that's disembodied in a set of boundary conditions.
Yeah.
And by disembodied, I mean the way that the signals propagate is relatively homogeneous within that set of boundary conditions that you've established. And the brain, of course, does not have that. It doesn't have a homogeneous set of rules about how signals would propagate. And things like boundary conditions that we would think about in space are really going to be boundary conditions determined by the way that different neurons are coupled to one another through.
But I think this is a really important point for neural field theory, is that to first order, as I can show with some of the data, there is a lot of isotropy in the way the brain is connected.
Okay.
There's an exponential distance rule which dominates all aspects of connectivity. So, this is the principle that nearby areas are strongly connected.
Yeah.
And that as you get further and further, the density of synaptic connections drops off exponentially. And this has been shown in diffusion-weighted imaging data from humans, but also, importantly, work of Henry Kennedy and others, direct tracer studies in different species. So this is like the backbone of connectivity.
But if we think about, let's say, pick some modality. Let's say we think about vision.
Yeah.
And we say, well, what we care about is we know that let's say we're pivoting our perspective of vision around V1,
Yeah.
right? So about 2/3 of the connections that it has with pulvinar and LGN, there's 2/3 of its connections to the thalamus are actually from V1 back into thalamus to sort of shape the types of inputs that you get from the visual system in. And then the outputs that it has are, while there are many connections from early visual cortex to the whole brain, I mean, there really are specific visual pathways where when you impair those, you impair vision. And that's not the case when you impair, let's say, other pathways. So the connectivity of early visual areas to the rest of the brain is extraordinarily inhomogeneous, right? We can talk about visual fields, we can talk about the dorsal and ventral visual streams. And what we can say is that the reason why we have those names is because of how tightly coupled those other areas are in visual processing to early visual cortex.
Okay, so there definitely are region-specific rules
Yes.
that are exceptions to the norm. And also what I was talking about with the exponential distance rule pertains largely to the cortex.
Sure.
The circuitry to subcortical structures and back, and to the hippocampus, which is archicortex, aren't part of this background exponential distance rule.
Sure.
Now, vision is obviously a bit of a counterexample, but it's still, to first order, obeys this exponential distance rule. You might have seen recently the foundation connectivity from mouse visual cortex that was published in Nature this year,
Sure.
with all the connectivity of individual neurons sort of carefully curated. So a former PhD student of mine has started looking at this, and the overarching rule that he's found is that things are just at that microscopic layer pretty randomly connected. All neurons are pretty randomly connected to everything around them, with the exception that there's quite a lot of reciprocal connections, particularly to the local inhibitory neurons, and we build them into our neural field models. And then, you know, to a large extent we've looked at this, the exponential distance rule still pertains to how visual cortex is connected to the rest of the cortex. There are exceptions, particularly to the frontal eye field, and these stand out as much more strongly connected than this background exponential distance rule. But for information processing, I think these background connections are hugely important to what the circuits are actually doing. But put it this differently, if you go to a football ground, are you listening to the roar of the crowd, which is what we're doing with neural field theory, or are you listening in very microscopically, or even to the circuits around the bar or around the food court, or to individual people talking? Now, you might listen to some people talking at a football ground, and if you filter out the noise of the crowd, it hardly sounds like they're a football ground at all. But if you listen to the football ground, you won't hear anybody talking.
Sure.
So this is like the neural field is the roar of the crowd. Now, the visual system is intact. It has all its specific rules of connectivity, but the field is the tone that makes the visual circuit work when you're alert and focusing on visual stimuli. That same visual circuit is completely sedated if you're in stage 1 sleep, which is a very rapid state transition. And it's also very dysfunctional, for example, under anesthetics. It's distorted by, for example, alcohol. But the same underlying circuitry is very state dependent on what the neural field is doing. And in particular, to go the other way, if you want to use the visual system, you need to turn the field on, because most pyramidal cells, for example, their firing threshold are way above their resting potential. So to get close to their firing potential, they need this chatter of other neurons around them to push the membrane potential closer to threshold, so that when you focus on something and there's input from the thalamus, these circuits get turned on, and then you perform these visual computations. But if the field isn't there, the visual circuitry won't be able to work. So it's actually designed to be turned on when you're awake and when you're focusing with top-down control on what might be salient in the visual field. So all of that hard work of lifting the visual circuitry to have affordances is what the neural field is doing.
So what you're describing to me sounds a lot like a mechanism for attention, a mechanism for allowing, let's say, a given circuit to be engaged in processing specific stimuli that come in, and then the nuances of the local brain activity are going to be specific to the nature of the visual input. But you're saying that it relies on a distributed field that sets that up, and that field could be thought of as an attentional mechanism, sort of like what used to be called the spotlight of attention, except here
it's not a spotlight, it's a mode across the whole brain. And we've shown this with fMRI data that we took, as you probably know, this James Pang and Alex Finito's paper published in Nature. We took hundreds of brain maps, or maps from hundreds of subjects from the human connectome, doing all different tasks. And traditionally, these were reconstructed by, the general linear model, looking at voxels that were activated. 32,000 voxels, but we could reconstruct 90% of the signal, 90% of the map from just 10 modes. So these aren't searchlight. So you're right in that to first order you can think of them.
A network of attention in this case rather than...
It's a mode of attention. It's like, and it's shaped by the geometry of the brain. So it's a set of regions by combining a small number of modes that are in these up states.
So, I mean, I guess for me this would, and I apologize for those in the audience that might not be familiar with it, but this seems something like... if you're thinking about particles and momentum, switching to a K-space, to a momentum space. And that the representation that you have is simplified when you've performed this transformation, such that that's a more general way of describing brain activity across people than saying where activity is in any given person.
Well,
is that right?
Yeah, I think it's the modes do have a spatial deployment. It's like K-space in the sense that you were just saying these are the low frequency modes that get turned on, that then allow these circuits to be primed to be active. And then you've got to still, need to look at your visual circuits and your other circuits. But how does the visual circuitry get coordinated with auditory circuitry or premotor top-down control? And these are these large modes that get activated by the neural fields.
So, I mean, I guess my view of distributed brain dynamics has for a long time, I've thought of, let's say, the thalamus as a type of conductor. And it relatively releases different brain areas to be engaged with one another by having tonic suppression, by synchronizing them, and that then this gets released. But this is a very different model because in this case, there is no conductor. What you're describing are distributed fields that are an emergent property of the distributed brain state.
Well, I think the thalamus is a great example where we've probably got quite a lot of convergence because we put the thalamus into the cortical. Most of our neural field model is a corticothalamic neural field model, and the thalamus is a resonator in its relationship with the time-delayed interactions. So the thalamus, through being activated and causing resonant frequencies or being suppressed, and suppressing some of the frequencies and let some of the higher order modes be expressed is doing more or less what you're doing. It's resonating certain channels, or it's suppressing. So what we've seen, and this is not work by our group, but work that was recently presented by Giulia Preti, is that different cortical states and this was with MEG data, differ, I'll step back a bit. Different cortical states roughly can be reconstructed with a small number of low order modes. But when you ask somebody to put more effort in, cognitive effort, it seems that the difference is not these big low order modes, but high frequency spatial modes with high temporal carrier frequencies. So you seem to turn them on with more cognitive effort. So how did that get back to your question? Yeah, in these cases, you kind of need to suppress the dominant modes and allow the higher spatial frequencies to be turned on. So these then map more specifically to particular circuits. Maybe the visual circuit coordinating with auditory cortex to do vision and auditory integration and other things.
Sure.
Yeah. And I'm keen to talk about the hippocampus at some stage, but
yeah, well, why don't you tell us a little bit about the hippocampus? Now's the time, right?
So the hippocampus is not an area I have a lot of domain expertise in, but we started looking at the hippocampus because we were working with people doing dementia research. So obviously, if you want to get a foothold in Alzheimer's disease, you better understand the medial temporal lobe and the hippocampus. So, and there's beautiful work with the hippocampus, both anatomical work, microstructural work, theta oscillations.
So, sorry, I'm just thinking of how I regularly take out the hippocampus and burn it for my patients with epilepsy. But of course, these people have a highly dysfunctional, the hippocampus is highly dysfunctional. And they do very well provided that you
preserve one hippocampus.
Yeah. And that if they have bilateral disease, you take that into account before you injure one, right? Because the two sides may be compensating from one another. Sorry to distract from that.
Well, you better be careful more for the people who spent their lives studying the hippocampus than old mate Breakspear, who's just suddenly found the hippocampus. So, work of Bizarki about theta oscillations, and recently work showing that these theta oscillations propagate up and down the hippocampus as traveling waves. I mean, if you want to look at waves in the brain, the hippocampus is the canonical brain area.
Sure.
And it seems from recent work that the hippocampus, the posterior tail of the hippocampus, connects to sensory and motor areas.
Sure.
And the anterior tail connects to sort of higher order executive areas, so-called default mode, precuneus, anterior cingulate, the superior temporal pole. And so when you're encoding information, as information goes from sensory to executive cortex, you've got these waves going from the posterior to the anterior tail to the anterior head. And then if you want to retrieve information, it looks like the waves are going in the opposite direction and coordinating with sort of autobiographical memory being moved back into sensory cortex. So these waves in the hippocampus, there's a lot of evidence for them. Their functional role is beginning to emerge. But what comes out is that wave-wave interactions between hippocampus and cortex might actually be a really fundamental principle of working memory and many cognitive processes. Notwithstanding Dr. Miller's propensity to remove one of the hippocampus, it does seem to be crucial to many of our cognitive functions and coordinating, being more like a conductor in the orchestra.
And I should clarify, when we do these kinds of interventions, these are the places that are generating seizures and destroying, people's ability to have normal lives. And in fact, the ability of the preserved side to compensate is such that their ability to coordinate, let's call them higher order cognitive functions, improve dramatically if you can reduce the seizure burden.
It seems because the hippocampus plays such an important, almost privileged role in interacting with the cortex, that might be precisely why many seizures arise from cortico-hippocampal circuitry, because it needs to be primed near criticality so that you get this rapid transition. I was talking about eigenmodes or brain fields increasing tone.
Sure.
So cortico-hippocampal interactions seem to be increasing tone in the right way, in the right sequence of events.
I certainly think about the information processing in the hippocampus as encoding sequences rather than places. Like I remember someone named Eva Pastelkova, and she is a great neuroscientist who came through Busaki's lab. And there had always been this idea that the hippocampus is encoding places, right?
Yeah.
So you put a rat in a maze, and every time it passes through the particular point, there's activity in a certain part of the hippocampus at a particular phase of the oscillations that you would measure in the hippocampus, and what the central frequency is for that oscillation is going to be different in different species. But what was interesting was she showed that if you have rats run through the same maze in an opposite way, equivalent, what they call place fields, did not become active. And then if you had rats run to a particular point in the maze and you put them on a wheel, that at regular times throughout the interval that they had to run in the wheel, specific spots would become active. So if they memorized a sequence that they had to do and then perform that sequence, let's call them milestones in a sequence that triggered activity at different points in the hippocampus rather than physical locations. And so maybe that's how we, and extrapolating from rodents to humans can always be difficult, but maybe that's how we organize our ability to engage in complex tasks is you make a plan, and that plan really corresponds to a sequence that's held in the hippocampus. And perhaps the way that we strafe the hippocampus with oscillations allows you to encode, let's say, multiple steps. If you talked about having superimposed oscillations or waves in the brain, maybe it allows you to encode superimposed steps to order. Let's say you have to coordinate sensory processing of one kind, audio, auditory, visual, with specific motor actions you'd have to do. If you think about coordinating those two over time, you have to be able to simultaneously preserve multiple representations that bring together both your plan for action and also the sensory input that you have at the same time. I mean, perhaps that's a way that this is done.
I think this wave approach to how to understand the brain simplifies a lot of the problems that we'd otherwise have if we study each function and each circuit in separation, because we're coordinating speech with hand movement.
Yeah.
But also, just to go even more broadly, when you think about Carl Friston's work and many other people's work on the hierarchical structure of perception,
Yeah.
you know, you've got my finger, which is a colour with an edge, which is forming the shape of a thumb, on my hand, which is part of Michael Breakspear, during me giving a talk.
Sure.
So if I'm encoding that, I might go from the bottom of the hierarchy to up to the top of the hierarchy. And if I then want to retrieve the information, then there's more like a reverse process, going from, well, Michael Breakspear was doing something, gesticulating with his arm, and then made a point about his thumb. So you can think of these waves going from sensory motor cortex up to executive cortex and then coming backwards again. So hierarchies are pretty static. But if you put them into a sequence, then you might start to think, well, now we've got how to link the different levels of the perceptual hierarchy.
Sure.
So we've talked a lot about, say, visual pathway or even memory encoding. These are a little more concrete. Have you been able to use the brain field equations to describe more, I guess, abstract features such as mood or these sorts of states, bring it back to your psychiatry clinical expertise, or you think that'll ever happen?
Questions. Mood is something that I've kind of always struggled to have a formal operational definition for, even though I treat patients with mood disorders. It could be thought of as the tone of thought, you know, the sort of biases that we see in people with depression, the sort of speed of thought, you know, when you get mania, people get sped up. It's quite interestingly that their speech gets sped up, but they also drive more quickly and they walk more quickly. So there's a whole chronobiology as well, which seems to be tightly linked to mood. No, I think all of that sort of remains elusively beyond what I've been thinking of. However, I have been thinking a lot about the sort of large language models, particularly multi-headed attention for large language models, and even closer to what I've been discussing, probably generative AI for image production. So as you may know, we're talking about variational autoencoders for DALL-E. They take very high dimensional images annotated by text, like the space of 100 pictures of Camilla's face is extraordinarily high dimensional. These variational autoencoders have penalties to find low dimensional or latent manifolds. And they learn the manifold, which we don't really understand what it looks like, but it's massively low dimensional compared to the high dimensional pixel space. Then you can, all the information is then on a Gaussian, and you can resample it. Then you can go backwards through the variational autoencoder and you can get a new picture of Camilla that never actually existed, but has many of Kai's physical properties. And this process is a form of constrained diffusion, or formally a form of the Fokker-Planck equation, constrained to be solved on a low-dimensional manifold, and then blown back up with a particular text prompt. It's not unlike, and I might be accused of taking a few liberties here, but there's other people working on cortex and hippocampus, and there was a beautiful TICS review paper, I can't remember the authors. High dimensional representations on the cortex map onto a lower dimensional hippocampal state of activity, a wave in the parlance of Michael Breakspear. This is like a latent manifold representing the percept or reducing the essential aspects of the percept. And then when you need to retrieve the wave gets reenacted on the hippocampus and blown back up in its full multidimensional glory on the cortex. I think there may be an analogy between cortico-hippocampal dynamics and these latent manifolds on the hippocampus and latent diffusion or stable diffusion for image generation.
I think there's some interesting questions to ask about anytime you think about diffusion or some simple Gaussian process, that you're taking something that should be very highly interconnected and nonlinear and having to linearize it, right? Because that's what Gaussianity would imply. But
that's exactly where the analogy breaks down, though, because we're talking about damped wave equations,
yeah.
Therefore harmonic oscillators,
yeah.
and not just boring old diffusion, although I still don't fully understand the Fokker-Planck equation, so I can't say it's that boring.
I'm sure you understand it better than I do. So I like to get a little bit new age on you, and particularly because you're a psychiatrist, right? So when we're interacting in relationships or having a conversation, there's this idea that there's something that we're doing that is aligning the internal dynamics that we would have, right?
Yeah.
We have a conversation, we are making associations with similar memories that we have
Yeah.
that may be contextually very different from one another, but we are reinterpreting the own set of internal states that we have in past events we've experienced in our lives such that we have a common shared experience. Do you think that, let's say certain people who may have what we would call spectrum-like behavior, have an inability to effectively generate the types of dynamical states that other people have as a mechanism for what could be as simple as some social difficulty all the way to people that are further out on the autism spectrum? Do you think that it's not just the ability to model, and maybe in a dynamical system, this is a false distinction I'm drawing, the internal state of others and then predict what they would have, right? That would be the classic sort of systems neuroscience view would be that you have theory of mind, I'm modeling what your set of goals are and then trying to predict how the next way I should behave and that you should behave in a conversation or an interaction where we'd have some shared goals in order to do something together. And humans evolved this because we had to have coordinated behaviors going a long while back for social function, hunting, a variety of all these other crazy things that makes humans humans. We would classically say that people that are on the spectrum can't effectively model the internal states of others. They have some dysfunction in their theory of mind. But in the framework that you're developing, maybe it would be that the two of us have internal dynamical states that we set up, and there's something about there being some concordance between the two sets of dynamical states that we each have, and that people who have autism or things on the autistic spectrum and behaviors on the autistic spectrum that are less, let's say, comprehensive, really it's just their ability to generate the same kinds of internal dynamical states as others have are misaligned. And so if we could develop proxies that would help them to do that, we might be able to make it so that they had much easier social interactions because they could align their internal dynamical state more easily with others. And that's pretty new agey. I'm sorry about that.
There's a lot to unpack there, a lot to unpack.
And that's usually, I study motor physiology, right? So it's pretty far from what I know about, but that's kind of the kind of thing I would think about.
I think one of the many things where we're radically different from AI is that we're physically embodied in a physiological system. And I bought a Garmin watch a few years ago, and just to look at my health. And then I noticed every Thursday when I have my clinic, my stress levels are really low. And I realized that, during training to be a psychiatrist, you implicitly do quite a lot of biofeedback. And when someone comes in to talk about their problems, to be receptive, you've learned to really reduce your arousal levels. And that becomes really a therapeutic opportunity for someone to talk to you, probably as much as what the content of what you speak in exchange is meaningful. Mm-hmm. And I think in two-way dyadic relationships, interacting through our bodies, which we don't really read, is really hugely important. All the subtle things like heart rate, breathing, eye movement, these allow the two brains to interact through interoceptive signals that we're giving each other. And that sets the tone then for two-person dyadic interactions.
Sure.
Now, people with high on the autism spectrum disorder often have highly aroused physiological states, particularly when they're interacting in social environments.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the difficulty that some people, because it's a very varied set of differences, or atypical neurodevelopmental trajectories, that they don't have the interoceptive synchronization. And we know, people with ASD, or what we call it, have high arousal in social interactions, often changes in gut physiology and other differences that might make it difficult for interoceptive alignment. I think that's a big part of why people often struggle in social interactions, and what makes it relatively easy for other people to interact dyadically.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people on the spectrum do pretty well when they're not in that one-on-one, face-to-face interaction. And I think the other thing is they're trying really hard. A lot of the patients that I see get others feel that they don't really care in a social situation because of all the differences that you highlighted, eye movement and being too frank or something. But a lot of my patients feel very distressed about these social interactions and aware that they're kind of getting it wrong and trying really hard to do better. But that trying probably increases the arousal and makes it even harder in the social interactions just to go with the flow. That's about as much as I've got at the moment. I know there's a whole field on hyperscanning, but like everything, like looking at two brains in a scanner,
Sure.
or with NIRS or with EEG, I think that's interesting, intriguing work, but without an underlying theory, like a neural field theory, I think it's going to be just driven by correlations and not driven by a deeper understanding of how the brain might be working.
Yeah, a shared auditory input from the environment, that kind of thing, more than the percept of the other.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then imagine what happens if now all your interactions exclude that, and then you have a phone.
Yeah.
Yeah. This has been really interesting. Anything you'd like to bring up or talk to folks about before we bring things to a close?
Well, I think it's a great time to be in systems neuroscience. And it's a great time to be, I sat on the way here next to a pure mathematician from the University of Sydney, June Kim, and it's a tough time for mathematicians because of funding, because they can't necessarily demonstrate how they're making the nation better by studying geometry, but they're studying geometry and they're pushing other things out. And AI has given mathematicians a lot of applications in thermodynamics.
Yeah, sure.
But we need to preserve pure maths and pure science, because that's where a lot of the discoveries will later come from. But I do think it's a great time to be conceptually in the field, and maybe that's a hope as global politics and politics in regional politics make it harder and harder for people to come together and to exchange ideas.
Yeah.
That we can continue to hold hope in our scientific and musical and artistic endeavors.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully we're not entering a time of sort of global balkanization. We can really, the scientific community can be fluid, so we can bring you back.
That would be bad for everybody.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you.
And thank you for
For your Stein. Absolutely.
Yeah, which I'll take home
Yeah.
and enjoy back in Newcastle, Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for tuning in.